The notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded once and slipped under my gate like a threat. HOA violation assessment. $450,000 due immediately. I laughed at first, actually laughed out loud, because I don't live in an HOA. Never have. My property sits just outside a polished suburban neighborhood with identical roofs, trimmed hedges, and a board that loves flexing authority. I figured it was a clerical error. Maybe the wrong address. Maybe some intern misclicked a spreadsheet. But when I unfolded the pages and read the listed violations, asterisk unauthorized structures, improper land use, environmental non-compliance asterisk, my stomach tightened. Every single violation referred to my land. The same land I've owned quietly for years. By noon, my phone was ringing non-stop. Voicemails stacked up from an HOA office number I didn't recognize. The tone shifted fast, from friendly reminder to formal demand to legal escalation. By evening, an email landed claiming my land had caused neighborhood-wide depreciation and that fines had accumulated over time. $450,000. The number felt absurd, like a typo with too many zeros. But at the bottom was a signature from the HOA president herself, complete with a warning. Failure to comply may result in liens, seizure, or legal action. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. This was a power play. The next morning, two strangers in polos and clipboards walked onto my property without asking. One started snapping photos. The other began measuring the edge of my gravel road like he owned it. When I confronted them, they didn't apologize, they smirked. One of them said, "HOA inspection. This land falls under our jurisdiction." I asked him to point to the boundary marker. He waved vaguely toward the houses behind him. This whole area was absorbed years ago. Absorbed. Like my land had just been quietly swallowed without my knowledge. When I told them to leave, they warned me that trespass notices would only increase the fines. That was the moment annoyance turned into something sharper. I went home and pulled out the original documents from when I purchased the land, old but clear. Metes and bounds descriptions. County stamps. Recorded deeds. Nothing about an HOA. Nothing about shared control. In fact, the documents showed something strange, a reference to a master parcel subdivided decades ago. My land wasn't a leftover sliver, it was the anchor parcel everything else had been carved from. I checked the parcel numbers again. Then again. The neighborhood behind me? Same route parcel ID. My pulse picked up. That couldn't mean what I thought it meant, right? That evening, another letter arrived, this one certified. Notice of intent to place lien. I sat there staring at it, documents spread across the table, lines connecting in my head that the HOA clearly never expected anyone to notice. They thought they were bullying a landowner into paying a made-up fine. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that the paperwork they ignored for years told a very different story. One where the land they claimed authority over was never actually theirs to control at all. And the deeper I dug into the county records, the worse it got for them. By the next morning, I was at the county records office the minute the doors unlocked. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not the HOA, not a lawyer, not even friends. I wanted facts before I made noise. The clerk behind the counter looked bored as she slid the terminal toward me and asked for the parcel number. When I entered it, her posture changed. She leaned in, frowned slightly, and said, "That's a parent parcel." I asked her what she meant. She rotated the screen so I could see it clearly. The neighborhood behind my land, the neat rows of houses, the manicured lawns, the HOA clubhouse, all of it branched off from my parcel, subdivided decades earlier but never fully transferred the way the HOA documents claimed. The silence that followed felt heavy. This wasn't a gray area. This was a paper trail. I requested everything: original subdivision plats, transfer records, easements, tax histories. Page after page came back stamped, dated, and painfully clear. The HOA had authority over the homes, but the land beneath them? That was another story. Somewhere along the way, a bulk transfer had failed, and instead of fixing it, the developers had built anyway. Years later, the HOA inherited the mess and never bothered to verify the foundation of its power. Worse, property taxes on the master parcel were still being paid, by me. Every year. Cleanly. On time. The clerk raised an eyebrow and said something I'll never forget. You might want to talk to an attorney, but this looks very interesting. When I got back to my property, a notice was taped to my gate. Final demand before enforcement action. They were escalating fast, faster than someone who knows their right usually does. I called the HOA office for the first time. The receptionist transferred me straight to the president. No greeting. No pleasantries. Just her voice, clipped and irritated, asking when I planned to pay. I told her I had a question first. Simple one. Can you tell me which deed gives the HOA authority over my land? There was a pause. Then she said, confidently, it's all in our governing documents. I asked her for the recording number. Another pause, longer this time. She promised to have legal send it over. They never did. Instead, what I got was a different kind of response. 2 days later, heavy machinery showed up at the edge of my property. Survey flags appeared overnight, bright orange like warning signs. A contractor told me he'd been hired by the HOA to correct violations and restore community boundaries. That was it. I ordered them off my land and posted no trespassing notices with the parcel number clearly marked. Within hours, my phone exploded with angry messages from neighbors, people I'd never spoken to, accusing me of delaying improvements, lowering property values, and fighting the HOA for no reason. They had no idea they were standing on land their association didn't fully own. That night, I laid everything out across my table. Maps, plats, deeds, tax receipts, lining them up like evidence in a trial. The picture was undeniable now. The HOA didn't just overstep. They were enforcing rules on land they had no legal claim to, and worse, they were threatening liens for nearly $500,000 to cover up their own oversight. The fine wasn't punishment, it was pressure. A gamble that I'd fold before discovering the truth. What they still didn't realize was that the truth didn't stop at fines or boundaries. Because if the records were right, and they were, then every house in that neighborhood sat on land that legally traced back to me. And once I confirmed that with a property attorney, everything was about to change. The attorney didn't laugh when I spread the documents across his desk. He didn't smirk, didn't downplay it, didn't warn me I was misreading something. He went very still. Page by page, he checked the plats, traced the parcel numbers with his pen, and compared them to the county printouts. After nearly 20 minutes of silence, he leaned back and exhaled slowly. You weren't fined by mistake, he said. You were fined because they were hoping you wouldn't look this closely. According to him, the HOA's claim relied on an assumption that had never been legally finalized. They had authority over structures and residents, but not the underlying master parcel. In legal terms, that meant their $450,000 fine wasn't just invalid. It was dangerous. He drafted a response that afternoon, measured, precise, and devastating. It demanded immediate withdrawal of all fines, acknowledgement of trespass, and proof of any claimed ownership interest. Attached were copies of the deeds, tax records, and subdivision history. The letter ended with a single line that felt like a switch flipping. Our client reserves all rights associated with ownership of the master parcel. It was sent certified and electronically. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short, tense, and very different from before. This is the HOA's counsel. Please call me as soon as possible. No threats. No deadlines. Just urgency. When I returned the call, the tone had changed completely. Their lawyer asked questions, careful ones. Had I leased any portion of the land? Had I granted easements? Was I asserting ownership over the developed lots? I answered truthfully and briefly. The more I spoke, the quieter he became. At one point he stopped me and said, I need to confer with my client. That was the last I heard from him that day. But the reaction from the HOA came fast. By evening, the inspection notices were gone from my gate. The machinery vanished. The online account showing my balance due? Suddenly inaccessible. It was like watching a bully clean up a mess before the teacher walked in. The real shock came the next morning when a neighbor knocked on my door, nervous, confused, holding a printed email. The HOA had sent out a temporary clarification notice, claiming there was an internal review of property records and asking residents not to engage with outside parties regarding land matters. Outside parties. That's what they were calling me now. The same HOA that had been issuing fines and threats days earlier was suddenly telling people to stay quiet. The neighbor whispered, "Do you actually own the land under our houses?" I didn't answer directly. I just said, "I own what the county says I own." His face said everything. Behind closed doors, the panic was setting in. My attorney explained what this meant if the records held up, which they did. The HOA's authority depended on land rights they never legally secured. Any enforcement, any fine, any lien they issued could be challenged. And the neighborhood itself? Built on land still titled to someone else. I wasn't looking to evict anyone or burn the place down, but the leverage was undeniable. The $450,000 fine they'd thrown at me was nothing compared to what they were suddenly facing. By the end of the week, we received a formal request, not a demand, not a threat. A request. The HOA wanted a meeting. Closed door. No residents. No board minutes. Just their leadership and my attorney. They wanted to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution. The phrase almost made me laugh. A week earlier, they tried to crush me with fines. Now they were asking for peace. What they didn't know yet was that I had no intention of walking into that meeting unprepared. Because if they wanted a resolution, they were going to have to explain why they fined the owner of their entire neighborhood in the first place, on record. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in a conference room the HOA usually reserved for disciplinary hearings. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just weeks earlier, that same room had been used to threaten homeowners with fines over trash bins and fence colors. Now, the blinds were drawn tight, the sign-in sheet removed, and the board sat stiffly behind the long table like defendants instead of judges. The HOA president wouldn't meet my eyes. Their attorney did all the talking at first, carefully framing the situation as a documentation discrepancy and an unfortunate misunderstanding. My attorney let him speak uninterrupted. Then he placed the county-certified plats on the table and slid them forward. "This isn't a discrepancy," he said calmly. "This is ownership." The mood shifted instantly. The president's composure cracked when my attorney explained that the HOA's authority over my land was non-existent, and always had been. Every inspection, every threat, every fine issued against me was unauthorized. Worse, the $450,000 assessment wasn't just invalid. It exposed the HOA to claims of harassment, trespass, and attempted fraud. When asked why the fine was so high, the president stumbled. She muttered something about deterrence and community standards. That was when my attorney asked the question that froze the room. "Were you aware that the master parcel was never conveyed to the association?" Silence. No one answered. The answer was obvious. Then came the part they hadn't expected. My attorney explained what ownership of the master parcel actually meant. Access roads, green belts, easements, drainage paths, everything the neighborhood relied on traced back to that original land title. The HOA had been operating under assumed rights, hoping no one would ever challenge them. And now that someone had, they were scrambling to contain the fallout. The attorney leaned forward and said, "Our client is not here to disrupt residents. But he is entitled to recognition, compensation, and correction of the record." The word compensation landed hard. Pens stopped moving. The president swallowed. They proposed a settlement, quickly, nervously. Full withdrawal of fines. A written apology. A non-disclosure agreement. My attorney didn't even glance at it. He pushed it back and said, "That doesn't address past damages or future use." That's when panic showed. The HOA treasurer asked what future use meant. The answer was simple: leasing, easements, or restructuring ownership in a way that finally matched reality. The board members began whispering to each other. This wasn't about saving face anymore, it was about survival. If residents learned the truth without a plan in place, the HOA could collapse under lawsuits alone. By the end of the meeting, the power dynamic had completely flipped. The same board that once fined me without hesitation was now asking permission to speak, to pause, to consult. They requested time, 30 days, to negotiate terms with their insurers and developers. My attorney agreed, on one condition: all enforcement activity would cease immediately, and a notice would go out correcting the record about my land. Reluctantly, they agreed. The president signed the temporary order with a shaking hand. As I left the room, I caught a glimpse of the HOA president staring at the plats again, as if hoping they'd magically change. They didn't. And neither did the reality she was now trapped in. The fine they'd tried to use as a weapon had exposed a flaw so deep it threatened the entire neighborhood's foundation. And in 30 days, when the residents finally learned who really owned the land beneath their homes, the HOA wouldn't be able to hide behind closed doors anymore. The HOA waited exactly 29 days before sending the notice. Not 30, 29, like shaving off a day might somehow soften the impact. The email subject line was carefully worded, "Update regarding community land records." No mention of fines. No mention of ownership. Just a promise of clarification. But within minutes, my phone started buzzing. Neighbors I'd never spoken to before were reading between the lines, forwarding screenshots, and connecting dots the board had hoped would stay hidden. By that evening, the clubhouse parking lot was full, and the same board that once ruled with fines and threats now faced a room full of angry homeowners demanding answers. The president tried to control the narrative. She spoke about historic oversights and developer-era complications, insisting nothing would change for residents. That lie lasted less than 2 minutes. A homeowner stood up holding the corrected notice, one the HOA had been forced to issue, stating plainly that the master parcel underlying the community was privately owned and that negotiations were underway to resolve access and usage rights. The room erupted. People shouted questions about mortgages, property values, and whether their homes were even legally secure. The board had no real answers, because the truth was simpler and worse. They had never verified the foundation of their authority. What happened next surprised even me. Instead of panic turning toward me, it turned toward the HOA. Residents demanded to know how a board so eager to find them could miss something this massive. Old grievances resurfaced, selective enforcement, unexplained fees, threats over minor violations. The $450,000 fine they'd slapped on me became the symbol of everything wrong with their leadership. Within days, recall petitions circulated. Board members resigned one by one. The president held on the longest, but when the HOA's insurer declined coverage due to undisclosed risk, she was finished. The resolution came quietly after that. A revised agreement was recorded with the county, formally recognizing my ownership while granting permanent, paid easements to protect residents. No one lost their home. No chaos. Just a long overdue correction. The HOA was restructured under new leadership, stripped of powers it had abused for years. And the fine? Officially declared void, with a written acknowledgement that it should never have been issued. The same association that once threatened me with liens now had my signature securing their neighborhood's future. Sometimes I drive past the entrance sign and think about how close they came to never being exposed. If I'd paid the fine. If I'd ignored the records. If I'd assumed they knew what they were doing. But power built on assumptions eventually collapses. All it takes is one person willing to check the paperwork. They tried to fine me $450,000 for violations on my land. Instead, they discovered the truth too late. They were standing on it the entire time.